It's a question that comes up a lot, especially online. If liberals champion tolerance and acceptance, why do they seem unwilling to extend that same courtesy to conservatives? They ask that question in so many ways, but it's something like that anyway. At first glance, it feels like it might be hypocrisy, but the confusion really lies in what acceptance means and what it doesn't. So let's look at this little question that is so frequently put forth. It does have something to do with identity versus ideology. So let me explain that. Conservatives are more about you accepting their identity, while often critiquing or condemning the identities of others. Liberals tend to emphasize not only their own identity, but the acceptance of another person's identity, who other people are. Their race, gender, sexuality, perhaps even religion sometimes, depending on how inherent you believe that can be. These are things that define a person's being. To accept someone else's identity is to recognize their inherent dignity and not just accepting those inside of your own perceived identity. It's saying you deserve respect no matter who you are. It's more than just saying I deserve respect and those other groups do not, or they deserve less respect, or however you want to look at it. Now, maybe there are exceptions to that general rule. Well, in fact, there are exceptions. We've all experienced those. If we're anywhere, you're going to find exceptions to a rule, pretty much. But there are liberal leaning people who will carve out exceptions because liberals can also be bigots based on their own biases. For example, the anarchist Bakunin was in many ways a progressive leftist in his day, but he had anti Semitic views. He was a hater of Jewish people, basically. They were, you know, less than him in his estimation. Those were never a key component of his ideology, mind you. His anarchic views really had nothing to do with his anti Semitic views, but it's nonetheless true that he was bigoted in his own way. So it's an example of somebody who was on the left being a bigot. Still, individualized bigotries and hypocrisies aside, what I said is still the general gist of liberalism anyway. It's, the way it's commonly defined. Conservatives or right wingers, on the other hand, often emphasize acceptance of conservative ideology, what the conservatives believe or what they think conservatives believe, as the case may be. Of course, there are different views of what conservative even means. But for them, tolerance can mean respecting their own worldview, their perceptual moral framework. Even if you disagree with it or think evidence contradicts it, you are to accept it. And in an authoritarian setting, of course, you will have no choice but to accept their view. And that difference between broad acceptance of identity of other people versus restrictive ideological acceptance of their chosen, the right wing ideology, that's crucial for understanding why liberals and conservatives sometimes talk past each other when it comes to tolerance. Should a liberal tolerance involve accepting the intolerant or accepting the unacceptable, if you want to look at it like that. So that's a big part of why we dig in, so to speak. Both sides, you might say, I mean, I hate to both sides it, but both sides can dig in, and sometimes a person might be accused of being a bigot when they're not. Obviously, it depends on the scenario. But the question is, why does political disagreement feel like a personal attack? That's another relevant thing here. Well, for starters, like kind of hinted at, right wing policies often are literal attacks on people with different identities. And quite often, the right wing solution to problems is just what I've said many times. You take a problem and you beat it, bomb it, maybe throw it in a prison cell, and or starve it of resources. That is the the general gist of right wing solutions to problems. You just you punish it, you inflict violence upon it. Now, of course, you can find historical examples of ostensibly left leaning people being violent. Of course, you can find that, but that's usually not uh, due to the acceptance or tolerance of diversity. That's more to do with, I guess, authoritarianism, if you will, like the like the Soviet Union or something like that. And that can definitely complicate narratives about tolerance on the left. But authoritarianism is oddly enough, it almost becomes apolitical after a while. The difference between right wing authoritarianism and left wing authoritarianism, it might end up just being which produces a bigger stack of bodies. You know, the the fascists in the 1930s and 40s and similar movements, well, they ended up attacking too many people. That's one of the reasons they failed so fast back in their day. They were going after too many different groups. They were eugenicists, and that not only did they go after political opponents, but they, of course, believed in destroying other racial identities, right? So you had them attacking all sorts of different countries, all sorts of different beliefs, and of course, the world in the end decided to team up and fight that country that was really at the you know the epicenter of it, Germany. You know, we ended up teaming up to fight them, defeat them, and by this point, of course, there's been a resurgence in that sort of uh, negative energy, that authoritarianism, and it sort of makes this debate and discussion seem sort of silly, but nevertheless, it's kind of important to still address it as like a meat and potatoes sort of phenomenon. Getting back to basics. What is the difference between these different ideologies? And this is one of the key ones. In plenty of cases, the threat posed by right wing ideology is direct, and right wingers are increasingly making that crystal clear, with the creation of alligator Alcatraz and the celebration of the infliction of harm on different immigrant groups, and there's a real cruelty to that is no longer about keeping the country safe or anything like that. That illusion has just completely fell away. It's just increasingly obvious that they want to inflict bodily harm upon people. And that's, of course, one reason to oppose that sort of ideology, because one of the questions about what makes an idea or an institution legitimate, well, you have the question of, does it do more harm than good? You know, if something inflicts more harm upon human beings and in fact dehumanizes other people, well, that would be a sign that it's actually illegitimate. And the other question is, does the ideology or the organization do what it is supposed to do, what it claims that it does? In this case, when it comes to something like alligator Alcatraz or alligator Auschwitz, as some people are calling it, does it actually make the country stronger, safer, and freer, and all those propagandistic terms? Well, no, it does not. In fact, it's actually a threat to people, and obviously it's inflicting harm to people. So it's not really making people safer. And I just saw an example of ICE or DHS trying to deport a Native American woman, and that is obviously not a legitimate course of action. And they were claiming that it was done by mistake. But let's just put it this way: Kirsty Nome does not have the best history when it comes to Native American tribes. She's actually been banned from entering the land that is considered tribal land in her own state. So yeah, that's one of the signs that maybe she's on the wrong side of history, is that she's bringing back those old dynamics when in fact they were never totally gone away. This conflict between the US government and these Native American tribes, it's obviously not totally gone away, but she managed to piss them off to the extent that they actually banned her from even being on their land. I read that at least one tribe actually reversed that. I don't know if they've all done that, but I know that at one point that was the case. So of course the other aspect of this, what makes an organization legitimate, is can there be accountability? If there is wrongdoing from the organization or the ideology. And if you're talking about an authoritarian movement, well, there is limited accountability, or at least the illusion that the great leader up above everybody else cannot be held accountable. Of course, when push comes to shove, people will throw out the rule book and they will hold somebody accountable if they feel that they must. And that's just something that's been true throughout history. And I'll let you determine what that means in the greater context of legitimacy, because in a way legitimacy can also be like an illusion. You could say that all humanity is like somebody fumbling a football. We're always stumbling, we're always failing in some grand scheme of things. But it's just one of those interesting things about history, that it is cyclical. You have to face down illegitimate forces. You have to understand that these issues never totally go away. And the fascist impulse and the authoritarian impulse, which can go hand in hand, well, those are unfortunately always threatening to come back on the global scene. And here's the other thing: political beliefs aren't just opinions and have never just been opinions. They are part of our identity, so to speak, part of our society, and also part of our thinking and our brains. When someone challenges your political views, your brain doesn't treat it like a debate, at least a lot of the time. It treats it like danger. And neuroscience research actually shows this: when people are confronted with facts that contradict their worldview, the same parts of the brain that handle emotional and defensive responses will light up. In other words, your brain goes into fight mode, not think mode. And then there's the social side of it too. Many of us build our communities, online and off, around shared political views. So admitting you're wrong doesn't just mean changing your mind, it can mean losing your friends, your status, or belonging. Who knows, maybe you could even lose your job. Employment discrimination might be, in some cases, linked to whatever political views you express. And I'm not saying that's always a bad thing. Sometimes maybe you should be shunned. But I'm just saying that when it comes down to it, this is a powerful motivator. It's why some people don't change their views, no matter how I would say twisted their views are. They were it was a part of their upbringing. They were brought up along those lines. And that's why people so often double down instead of backtracking. They're not just defending ideas, they're sort of defending themselves. And there's a competition between saving face and owning up, too, that's really at the heart of things now, too. The fear of losing face is significant. We've all been there, realizing you were wrong about something and feeling that sting of embarrassment. But here's the truth: admitting you're wrong isn't weakness, it's maturity. It says you value truth over ego, growth over image. So trying to save face might protect your pride and your emotional state in the short term, but it chips away at trust. People can sense when you're dodging accountability. And when you own your own mistakes, you actually show integrity. So denying mistakes makes you fragile, admitting them makes you credible. I guess you could put it like that. Of course, some people, they don't want to ever admit that they've made mistakes. And if you look at the liberal and conservative lenses, if you zoom out from the liberal perspective, accepting someone's identity is foundational to a just society. And again, that someone is not just you, the individual, but accepting people who are different from you. Diversity and equality aren't optional, they're essential for social harmony. And if you don't have diversity and equality, well, you lack that social harmony. And it turns out that when people don't accept diversity and equality, even if they're in their own little group, their own little enclave, they end up creating new enemies as well. So that's why these fascist movements over time, again, they start targeting all sorts of different people. It's never going to be just one or two groups that they hate, at least. Maybe I should say never, or shouldn't say never, but usually they expand it to involve new groups because they're I mean, at the core of it is the person's, their sense of superiority. They want to feel like they're above somebody else. And in that process, well, where do you draw the line? Do you just say you're superior to this one group? Well, that doesn't really feed your sense of superiority enough. That's why you have to have a whole bunch of different groups. You have to have uh like a hierarchy, almost like a totem pole of different groups with your chosen group on the top. So when liberals reject conservative ideologies, it's most often because they see how these ideologies are harmful and regressive. To them, it's not about intolerance, it's about protecting people from ideas that they know will cause harm. Now, obviously, I'm generalizing here. Some of this breaks down at the individual level, and conservative and liberal are relative terms in the first place. Liberals might contradict themselves and be conservative on some issues, and some conservatives can be relatively liberal. And of course, if you really try to understand those terms, you might find trouble along the way because they end up sometimes just seeming like they're meaningless. But from the conservative perspective, acceptance means respecting what they view as long-standing beliefs and values that have shaped society. They may see liberal critiques as threats to those foundations, as an erosion of order, whatever that means, or tradition, erosion of tradition or erosion of moral stability, all that kind of stuff. Of course, they are not always correct about what tradition is. For example, many of them claim the United States is a Christian nation, even though the U.S. Constitution clearly favors a secular government. Also, obviously, Trump is not just some traditionalist, as he seeks the authority of a king. Though, to be fair, all presidents have abused their power in some ways, and we have many examples of what could be called proto Trumpism, really throughout American history. But the point is, each perceived side believes it's defending something vital, and each side sees the other as intolerant in some sense. And when it comes to right wingers critiquing the left, they they are perhaps ironically in a way criticizing them for being intolerant of the intolerance of right wing ideology. So there's that great question of how do you bridge the gap? How do we move forward? So, first, by recognizing that both identity and ideology do matter, acceptance shouldn't stop at one or the other. Liberals can benefit intellectually from engaging more deeply and, to some extent, even respectfully with conservative ideas, even when they disagree, to better understand and argue against them. Well, when they deserve to be argued against, and most of them certainly do. And of course, that's to the extent possible. It's almost impossible to respect the uh, the expressions of fascism, for example, because it's just bigotry. But in a way, I think that sometimes you can engage with these sorts of views just to understand them, and in some cases, maybe actually change minds. Now that's obviously a controversial thing, even to engage or platform any of these people. But sometimes, if it's done well, it might be effective. Of course, there's a danger of not doing it well, and that's like a whole other thing. And right wingers can benefit, of course, from embracing the full diversity of modern life, even when it challenges their perceived tradition, which again is often inaccurate. They're often actually not arguing from tradition, but just from a place of bigotry disguised as some sort of tradition. So, to any liberals out there, I have known some former extremists, so I know that some sort of redemption arc is not only possible in some cases, but desirable. But, it's not always easy, and not everybody's going to make that transition. Real tolerance isn't easy. It asks us to listen, not just to nod politely, but to actually hear the person beyond the belief. And in the end, the goal isn't to win every argument, it's to live together in a society where disagreement doesn't mean disdain, and it doesn't mean a pile of dead bodies. So, all right, that's it for this episode. I hope I provided some food for thought, and you have a happy day.